Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So this series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. And welcome to our first Sunday edition. As I mentioned before, we're adding a Sunday show because election season is really heating up and we want to make a space to talk about conventions and polling and debates and October surprises and more. So from now through Election Day, we will have a special show on Sunday. And generally, I think it's going to be geared towards elections. We may stretch out a little bit, go a little bit longer than usual. We'll continue to invite the special guests that we have on from time to time. But today, as we ease into it, it is just me and Nicole Hammer of Columbia. Hello and happy Sunday.
Yes, happy Election Sunday.
Yeah, and we're not recording this on a Sunday. We're not working on the weekend. We should tell people we're pre-recording this, but it is coming out. You can use the theater of the mind to imagine that we are sipping our coffee. It is a lazy Sunday morning. So today, we should say we're starting this with something slightly different, not just the day of the week, but, usually we focus in on one moment. But actually, when we were looking at the calendar of things that happened around this day, July 19th, we noticed that this is kind of in the middle of a bunch of anniversaries for conventions and some of the most notable convention speeches, particularly of the 1980s. So we have Jesse Jackson and Mario Cuomo at the 1984 Democratic Convention, Ronald Reagan's acceptance speech in 1980 at the RNC, Ann Richards gave a really memorable speech in 1988. So we thought we'd kind of round them up, talk a little bit about what makes for a memorable convention speech and maybe what makes for a memorable convention speech in the 1980s. And so, we'll kind of go through them and try and pick out some parallels. They, again, are all around July 19th. And I kind of want to actually start with that date because I was looking, I think we've remarked on the show before that conventions used to be a lot earlier, right? Some of them were even in April or May. But even in recent years, they've dipped around because my memory of, the 2008 conventions, which I covered, were in September, really late. And here we're talking about conventions in July. This year's conventions are again back in September. The 2016 conventions were, I think, in late July. I mean, it's not a huge difference, but for some reason, it just seems weird to me that there isn't conventions are on the third week of June or July or the first week of September every time. And that's just the date. And they just bounce around and it's, I don't know, throws me off a little bit.
Yeah, they tend to clump around July and August. They're changing a bit this year because it's hard to know what in-person component of a convention will actually exist. But this is part of the issue of them being organized by private parties. And I mean that in a very literal sense. The parties organize them. They are private and they get to choose. So it's like the primaries, right? The date can move around a lot. I was just noticing that in 2008, the Iowa caucus was on January 3rd, whereas back in the 1990s, it was in February. It just bounces around quite a lot.
Yeah. And, the one thing that does happen with conventions, I think this is fairly standard in the modern era, is they are often right back to back. And, if you're covering them, that's the big, that's when you cross the exhaustion threshold and then you stay past that threshold all the way through November. But conventions, at least, I've only covered 2 cycles, are in my top 10 of most exhausting stretches of my life. It's pretty intense.
Absolutely. You want to triangulate to get the best convention bounce at the exact right time. And so I think that's a there's mind games happening here.
Yeah, and there's a whole bunch of political science about the convention bounce, which does seem to be real, but maybe is going away a little. And then this year will be a particularly interesting question about whether there's a convention bounce. Maybe we'll get into that at some point. Maybe we'll bring back our pal Harry Enton, who I know has lots of things to say about the convention bounce. That's right up his alley. But let's talk about convention speeches. And again, conventions really are remarkable things, and a lot of it is because there are speeches throughout the day. Some are super low profile, and then sort of builds and builds and builds, and then you get these speeches that kind of just pop. And to state the obvious, like when you have a gathering of all of the heavy hitters for a party, there's still going to be a person or two who somehow rise above. And I think there's probably no better example of that in the modern era, at least, than Mario Cuomo, governor of New York, father of current governor Andrew Cuomo, CNN anchor Chris Cuomo. He was governor of New York for a few cycles. He was a very prominent Democrat, but this is probably what he's most remembered for. And I mean, would you say this is the most famous non-nominee speech of the modern era? Maybe Obama in 2004 is up there.
Obama in 2004 is up there, Reagan in 1976. But this is definitely one where I don't think people, like with the Obama speech, like I don't think people really expected it. And even Cuomo himself is like managing expectations ahead of time. He says something like before he's about to go on, I'm not good at bringing people to their feet. I'm going to try to bring them to their senses, which is exactly the kind of line, by the way, that would bring people in a convention to their feet. But then he goes out there and he gives just a really good speech. And what made it good was that it drew the contrast between President Reagan and the Democratic Party in such a compelling way. And that's what people want. They want that plus charisma, and they're good to go.
Yeah. So this is the speech where famously, it's the two cities speech. He says this nation is more a tale of two cities than it is just a shining city on the hill. Now, that shining city on the hill line, I think, goes right at something that Reagan had used.
Yeah, so Reagan often called the U.S. a shining city on the hill. This was sort of his Cold War idea of what American was. And so for Cuomo to go right at that line, to make this kind of Dickensian parallel where he's like, yeah, all the rich people are doing great, but what about everyone else? It went right to the Democratic critique of the Reagan era and did so in just like this extremely well-written way. And I want to get to this in a bigger sense later on about kind of like which speeches pop. And there is this potentially this pattern of you get these notable speeches in years where the candidate actually is maybe a little more lackluster. But, this one, 1984, ends up being a huge landslide. Mondo wins, one state. So, there is this story, and I don't know whether it's written retroactively or not, but like people talk about standing in that hall, watching Cuomo speak and being like, oh, did we pick the wrong guy? Yeah, I mean, those are the same kinds of things that you would have heard in the Republican convention in 1976 when Ronald Reagan gives the speech before Gerald Ford goes on, was that people in the convention, and this is not retconning, like they were actually at the time just being like, oh no, we didn't nominate the right person this time around. And, of course, Reagan goes on to become the nominee the next year. And so I think that begins to feed this idea that if you make an amazing convention speech, maybe you're next in line for the party.
Right. And so Cuomo certainly enters that cycle. And, this is one of my favorite things about Mario Cuomo is his repeated, and it's really amazing, how much he flirted with and walked right up to the line and actually sort of kind of like reneged on some promises to like actually run and be a standard bearer for the Democrats. I mean, he doesn't do it in 84, but in 88 and 92, like he comes really, really close to running and is kind of considered the front runner. And he gains this nickname Hamlet on the Hudson because of his indecisiveness around all of this.
I love that. It's so poetic. But like this guy is basically being handed the nomination. The Democrats are like, please, we want you to be our presidential nominee. And he hems and he haws. But what's interesting, Jody, is that this also happens with the Supreme Court. There's some ideas floated that he might one day be nominated for the Supreme Court, and he ultimately turns down that consideration as well. So you get the sense that this is someone who wants to stay in private-ish life.
Yeah, and maybe just isn't willing to sort of take that big step, though he obviously rose to the occasion in this speech. A couple other things about this 84 convention. One is there's this famous story about Bill Clinton watching the speech and not feeling it. What his criticism is basically like, this is all fluff, not enough substance.
That is his criticism. And so 4 years later, when he gives his convention speech, he gives this substance-packed and somehow like 3 to 4 times longer than it ever should have been speech. And so when he gives his convention speech, it's very memorable because of how bad it was. And people thought that it had killed his political career, but ultimately he won the nomination in 92.
And we should point out that actually because Clinton kind of bombed so badly, actually Al Gore is then thought of as the front runner coming out of that cycle, and then Clinton has to work his way back. But just in general, like you think of Clinton as someone actually sort of Cuomo-esque who just wants to stand in front of an audience and soak it up and get them to rise to their feet, and to be reminded that his kind of first big moment was this like wonky, boring, overlong speech is interesting. One more thing on 84, then we'll keep cruising. This is a year in which there are kind of 2 big speeches. You have the Tale of Two Cities speech from Cuomo, and then you have Jesse Jackson, the Rainbow Coalition speech. And I mean, to have a convention where there's 2 speeches that there's a shorthand for and people remember them is remarkable. Anything you want to add about what Jackson was doing in his notable speech in 84?
I think the most important thing about Jackson's speech is that Jackson was a preacher, and he brought that preacher energy to the convention and was making an appeal for a more diverse and more representative party, like pitching his Rainbow Coalition. And that's not really the direction the party goes for a while. I think it's where the party ends up. But one of the reasons why this speech sticks is because the speaker knows exactly how to win over an audience.
Right. Say more about that the party doesn't go in that direction.
So, by 92, when Clinton becomes president, it's not to say that the party doesn't become more diverse in some ways, maybe representationally, like he brings more women in. But part of Clinton's strategy is sort of stiff-arming Black Americans at various times during his presidency. I know that he's famously called the first Black president by Toni Morrison. But, he also has that Sister Soldier moment that we talked about, which was about showing that he wasn't beholden to the Black vote. And so I wouldn't quite call it Jesse Jackson's party until probably 2008. Mm-hmm. But it's an important moment to have him there and running for president in 84.
Yeah. Okay, let's jump out of 1984, 4 years earlier, and let's talk about Reagan, who obviously came up. He was the incumbent in 84. In 80, he gives his acceptance speech right around this date and thought of as a really important speech in convention history. Give us a little sense of where he is at this point. I mean, he's not just ex-actor at this point. He has a little bit of a political career, but what does he need to do in this speech, and why does he tend to pull it off?
So I think he needs to come across as presidential, although that's just not as difficult for him by 1980, precisely because he'd had those 8 years in the governor's mansion. But he has to come off as serious, right? If there are still people out there who think of him as ex-actor Ronald Reagan, he has to show them that he has a vision for America. And the one thing that Reagan was really good at was that vision thing, right? That ability to sell people on an image of what the United States could be. And he did it in this way that was incredibly optimistic and incredibly picturesque. And because he was an actor, he was very good at selling this idea and believing in this idea and emoting towards people. It's not as big as his 76 speech, which I think really presented himself to the Republican Party as the next big thing. But I think it was important for selling himself to the American people.
Right. And then, it's that November that he gives the City on a Hill speech, which then, as we just discussed, gets, sort of critiqued a little bit by Cuomo. But, on this speech in 80, there's also a sort of foreign policy component. I mean, he was being painted as a sort of a war hawk. And I think he managed to talk mostly, as you were saying, about values. The New Yorker talked about the speech basically being about family, work, neighborhood, peace, and freedom. Very values-based. And I guess this comes to a bigger question for you, which is do most of the speeches we remember, are they the ones that are about values as opposed to policies?
Well, I mean, values and policies go hand in hand, right? But if you get too much in the policy weeds into the nuts and bolts, it starts to sound like a State of the Union speech. And there's a reason why we never remember State of the Union speeches. I mean, this is about...
Literally.
Exactly.
I can't remember. I guess I could, yeah. Wow, I'm doing this in real time. Can I remember a notable State of the Union line? I mean, I remember moments like the Supreme Court. Sorry, I'm getting off track here.
No. But I mean, I think that's right. our listeners can try this experiment at home. How many big moments do you remember? And that's because they're doing different work. And in this case, the work is sell me on what America is going to be with you in charge. And those tend to be more value-based than policy-based speeches.
All right, let's move to 1988 and Ann Richards, like incredibly fascinating character in American political history, governor of Texas. In 88, she gives the keynote address. She gives the nominating address for Dukakis and Benson in 88. It is, and this gives you a sense of her sort of rhetorical style, she's only the second woman to give a keynote convention speech in the Democratic Party, which she mentioned at the top of the speech by saying, 2 women in 160 years is about par for the course for women in these kinds of moments. Tell us a little bit about Ann Richards and what we learned from her from this speech.
Yeah, Ann Richards is a great choice here. I think that she was chosen not just because she was an excellent speaker, but she's not holding like a high-level position. She's the state treasurer of Texas. So why do they tap her? Because she's a Texan. And it becomes about going directly at George H.W. Bush's authenticity, right? Like poking him for being a Connecticut WASP who pretends to be a Texan, but...
Well, she has that line and she's like, this is what a real Texan sounds like. This is what a Texas accent actually sounds like, right?
Exactly. And I think that she says something like, George Bush was born with a silver foot in his mouth, to make fun of his inability to actually say the things that he means to say. And so that kind of teasing really can get under the skin of a politician, but politicians' authenticity is everything. And so her ability to go directly at that quality in George H.W. Bush really hit a weakness in his candidacy, and he wins. But that idea of him as a faux populist really does plague him for the 4 years he's in office.
And it kind of plagues his son as well, though his son wins twice.
His son wins against Ann Richards as governor.
That's right. She's governor until 94 when George W. Bush wins the governorship.
The Bushes get the last laugh.
Yeah, I suppose so. Right. So let me then come to this question I hinted at earlier. And I'm noticing now that a lot of these examples are Democrats, but, Cuomo and Jackson give a speech in which Mondale goes on to get trounced. Ann Richards gives a speech in which Dukakis loses. Obama in 2004 gives a speech in which Democrats lose an election. Is there anything to this notion that a lot of these maybe happened during losing campaigns? Does it say something about, is there anything about like a lackluster person at the top of the ticket allows for space for someone to break out below?
Yeah, I think when the candidate at the top of the ticket is not terribly charismatic or like isn't emotionally connecting with voters, they look for somebody else who's going to do that. I mean, another example here is in 92 when Pat Buchanan gives the speech at the Republican National Convention, and the heart of the convention is with him and not with George H.W. Bush. And I think that in each of these cases, the speeches are memorable because the heart of the convention is with these speakers, but that means that it's not with the person at the top of the ticket. And that's really important. And I think that's why we remember these in losing cycles. Right.
And there's also some strategy here, too, of like conventions are a place where people know that there can be breakouts and people thinking a cycle or two ahead. It's a place to start to elevate some of these voices, and which maybe backbencher gets a more primetime spot is often a signal of where the party sees its future. I will say, having been at the last cycle of conventions, that was one of the things that struck me, is that there didn't seem to be any of that. And I think that's one of the ways in which 2016 was so abnormal. But like, I think on the Democratic side, there was a sense that like, it's really about pushing Hillary Clinton to victory. And then on the Republican side, I think the convention was the place where like Donald Trump's capture of the Republican Party most sort of coalesced. And so you didn't see these like up and coming Republicans who maybe the party was positioning for future runs sprinkled throughout the evening. I was looking at the list earlier today, and it was just like a bunch of people who went up and said things about Donald Trump, and then Ted Cruz, who like got booed. But I'm curious, kind of where your head's at in terms of this, like thinking a cycle or two ahead.
Yeah, I think that is what parties are doing. I mean, they understand, again, conventions are put on by the parties, and they're kind of road testing some of their future leaders. And, I was there in 2016 as well, and you can see both on the Republican side, the breakdown of that pipeline that was already broken. And what I mean by that is the people in primetime were people like Michael Flynn and Laura Ingraham, who's a Fox News personality. They were people who aren't really in the electoral pipeline, but nor was Donald Trump. Right. And so who knows? The 2024 candidate could be one of these people who seems like a non sequitur up on stage. And so as the parties get roiled a bit more by these outside forces, it might be that conventions start to look different as the path to the presidency starts to look different.
But it is interesting, even on the Democratic side in this cycle, there wasn't a candidate in the cycle who you could say like had a springboard moment at the past convention. Julian Castro, I guess, gave like a notable speech and maybe gained some buzz coming out of that. But like, I don't know. It was just something the Democrats didn't seem to be lining up their next crop, which I think is a bigger thing about Democrats in general right now.
But I think you also see that reflected in the 2020 primary race, right? There was no person who emerged necessarily in that field either, that it ultimately was Joe Biden. And I'm not sure whether he gave a speech in 2016 or not, but that, sometimes the conventions really do reflect the future of the party, and sometimes it's just not very clear what direction the party is headed.
Right. Were you we didn't know each other in 2016. Were you there at the Republican convention?
I was there in Cleveland for what was a pretty wild convention. I think
it was a pretty wild convention. And I mean, I think it was also an indicator, what that happens at all conventions, that like there's just, especially since the early 80s, it's a TV product. And this tension between talking to the people in the room versus recognizing the many, many millions and more people who are going to see it on TV is obvious and strategic. But then when you're in the room, it's really dissonant because you're like, wait, we're in the room here, but they're not talking to us. And so many of the primetime speeches have that quality. Whereas maybe some of these that we just discussed in the 80s were maybe a little more geared towards the room and getting the room. But by the time we got to 2016, at least my sense of it was like, oh, they're talking right past, like literally right over my head to the camera that's behind me on the convention floor.
Yeah, they were increasingly becoming television products in the 80s and 90s, but they were still working it out, right? Because it wasn't that the nominee was still being decided in the 80s and 90s, but that's the big break, right? Once the nominating conventions are decided in advance, suddenly the conventions become a very different... They're serving a different purpose.
This shift towards the primacy of television, especially at the conventions, I mean, throughout politics in general, but it's certainly at the conventions is really interesting. And through the 80s, networks were cutting back on the amount of coverage they would give. It used to be this sort of gavel to gavel. Like, even if you just think of the images of older conventions, it's like a camera up high that's just like taking it in as an event. And then as you think of it now, it's like a TV produced event that is coming right into your living room. It's clear that these have become more and more packaged TV events over the years. And that was something that was sort of contentious throughout the 80s in this era that we're discussing. That said, the 2016 convention provided for me one of the most remarkable like in-person experiences I've ever had, which was, were you in the room for Ted Cruz's speech?
I was.
Okay, so Ted Cruz gets up there. Maybe we'll do this. I don't know. But Ted Cruz gets up there. He gives this speech. The Cruz-Trump dynamic had been going on for a long time, and there was this question about whether he was going to actually endorse Trump or not, and he tries to dance and he tries to kind of like not do it, and then the New York convention starts screaming at him and chanting endorse, 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 and then he utters this line, "You should vote your conscience," which is, I mean, at that point it was too late for anyone to really vote their conscience, but it was a sort of, it was a stand. And then he ends his speech and the room just erupts in boos. And I had by that point gone up into like the rafters of the arena, and I just will never forget like an actual physical sensation of standing there and feeling these boos like cascade up through the hall and hit me. And it was the only time in my life, Nikki, where I've actually like literally my jaw has dropped. Like, that's like a it feels like a cartoonish response and it's a turn of phrase, but literally I was standing there, my jaw just went wide open. I was like, holy smokes, I'd never experienced anything like that in person.
Yeah, I think that there were some other jaw-dropping moments in that convention as well.
Sure.
But I think that it was exactly right. It was a turning point in the convention in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And then, of course, in Ted Cruz's interesting path, like 5 months later, he's back in Trump's good graces and, they're best of pals these days. But that's for another time. Great. All right, let's leave it there. And that brings us to the end of our first Sunday edition. Nikki, this was great. A good chance to stretch out a little bit, talk about some speeches, talk about elections. Go enjoy your Sunday, finish your coffee.
Got to go do the Times crossword puzzle.
Oh, is that right? Yeah, you're one of those people who does it in like 7 minutes? Okay.
Maybe a little longer.
Okay. Thanks, everyone, for joining us on Sunday. We will, of course, be back next week on Tuesday and Thursday. But let us know what you think of the show. You may have noticed that we went a little longer than usual. That's something we might do on Sundays. So if you have thoughts about this edition, send us an email, thisdaypod@gmail.com. This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. You can follow us on social media at This Day Pod. That's on Instagram and Twitter. We will be back next week on Tuesday with a conversation about going to the moon, which we did once and we haven't done in a while. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
I'm delighted to be here with you this evening because after listening to George Bush all these years, I figured you needed to know what a real Texas accent sounds like.
We are not a perfect people, yet we are called to a perfect mission.
Work and family are at the center of our lives, the foundation of our dignity as a free people. When we deprive people of what they've earned or take away their jobs, we destroy their dignity.
There is despair, Mr. President, in the faces that you don't see, in the places that you don't visit, in your shining city. Mr. President, you ought to know that this nation is more a tale of two cities than it is just a shining city on a hill.
Radiotopia.